Hi everyone, this is Daniel Pink. I'm talking today with Jennifer Eberhardt. She's a social psychologist at Stanford University and author of the book Biased. Jennifer, thanks for being with us. I have to say, this book changed me. It had a monumental effect on me. I was shaken during much of it, and I now see the world differently afterwards. So I'm totally psyched to be talking to you. So let's get some of the basics out of the way here. Bias. Is that bigotry?
No, it's not. I mean, I think a lot of people think about bias as bigotry. They're thinking about people who are filled with hate, people who are burning crosses. But you know, when we're talking about bias here, we're talking about this sort of more subtle process, this implicit or unconscious bias. It's a type of bias that we're all vulnerable to, and we're vulnerable to it despite our motivations to be good and fair people.
Right, and so is everyone at some level biased?
Everyone at some level is vulnerable to acting on bias.
Vulnerable to acting on it. And this starts, and you talk about in the book what you call the other race effect, which is something that you found begins actually quite early in life. Tell us about that.
Well, researchers actually have found that this begins even at the age of 3 months.
Wow.
So these are infants who are already showing a preference for faces of their own race as compared to faces of other races.
Right. But that comes from experience. It doesn't, and you have research about that. So it's basically, if I'm used to looking at white faces, I have a preference for white faces.
That's right. Your brain kind of gets sort of practiced on those faces. It gets tuned to faces, the faces that you're most familiar with, and then the other faces that you're not seeing, you're not going to see them to the same extent or process them as deeply.
Yeah, and certainly for a 3-month-old, there's no animus underneath that. It's just how things are.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, this has some interesting implications out there. And one of the things I love about the book is how deftly you've woven in stories about the world, stories about your own life, along with the research. And there's one story that has really stuck with me, which has to do with some crime that took place in the Chinatown section of Oakland.
Oh.
Tell us about that and what happened there.
Yeah, so I went there. I was helping the Oakland Police Department with their reform efforts. So this was back in 2014, and the crime rate was going down generally across the city, but there was a huge spike in crime in Oakland's Chinatown. And so it turned out that there were black teenagers really going around, and they were robbing middle-aged Chinese women. They would snatch their purses basically when they were walking in the shopping district, and this kept happening, and the cops kept trying to figure out who it was, and they would find people that they thought were the suspects. But what happened was the Chinese women could not pick them out of a lineup
because all these young African men looked alike to them.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And again, it's not necessarily animus behind that. It's just our how we see the world. Now let's get to that for a moment, because you write a little bit about our brains. Our brains are in some ways categorization machines. Right?
That's right.
We always want to put things in categories.
Right.
So does that mean at some level this idea of bias is somehow wired in us? Is that taking things too far?
Well, I mean, to some extent, yes, it is, because our brain can't function without the work of categorization.
Right.
I mean, we're putting like things together, we're organizing things to sort of bring some coherence and order to the world. So we categorize, and we categorize everything, including people.
Right.
But when we categorize people, we're attaching, sort of beliefs about the people who end up in that category, right? And those beliefs we call stereotypes.
Absolutely.
We're attaching attitudes,
Right.
To the people in there, and that we call prejudice. And so if we add that up, sort of the prejudice and the stereotyping, that together is what we would call bias.
Sure.
And that can have real impact on behavior and decision making. And so forth.
And I want to get to the impact in a moment. But I want to talk. What I found really interesting is at some level, opening up the hood and seeing how it works. And one of the things that I was really taken with is this idea of seeing. How does seeing really work? And you're saying here that at some level we define first and then see.
Right.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, Walter
Yeah.
Lippmann actually said that first. And in 1922, the book he wrote called Public Opinion. Actually, he was a journalist, not a social psychologist, but he was responsible for giving us this.
And you know,
this
every
term.
journalist wants to be a social psychologist. So,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I know. I want to be a journalist now after writing
maybe
this
we
book.
should switch seats.
That's funny, but yeah, I mean, we borrow. You know, he put that term stereotyping in the literature. Yeah, it is about. You know, you have like things together, and then you start to develop beliefs about sort of how these things in this category function, and and when it's people, we do the same kind of thing, and to some extent we need to do that, right? We need to develop shortcuts for trying to sort of think about and make predictions about the things that we see, and so it's very functional, but at the same time it leads us into problems.
Sure. I mean, arguably, it's an evolutionary. Some of it's an evolutionary adaptation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, so what you have, I think, if I can rephrase some of what you're saying, is you have kind of the architecture of our brains,
right?
And then it's meeting the architecture of society.
That's right.
Okay. That's where things can get complicated. Let's talk about a little bit about how bias operates in the world.
Okay.
Because these implications are profound, and even though I think we have an intuitive sense this is out there. To me, at least for me, for one reader, seeing the evidence, the numbers, I found it staggering. So let's get straight to the point. You have a chapter in the book that you title "Male Black."
Yeah.
Why'd you pick that title, and what's the significance of that?
Well, it's a title that, well, actually it's a label that police departments use all across the country to identify suspects. And so you know their gender and you know their race. Oftentimes in the context of criminal justice, you're hearing sort of people calling into radio, you're hearing on the dispatch, the police radio, you hear male black, male black, male black all the time as an officer.
Right.
And so I was interested in what impact that sort of repetitive, sort of pairing of people who are male black with crime.
Exactly. Yeah.
How does that influence how they think? How does it influence how the decisions that they make on the street?
Absolutely.
So that's what the chapter's about.
But what you found was this incredibly powerful. What you write about in the book, and also what you found in your own academic research, and as well as other people's, is this incredibly tight association between crime and black.
Right.
Which has, so how did that, let's talk about how it developed, but then let's spend a little bit of time talking about the consequences of that.
Right. I mean, I think one of the ways in which it's supported is through, crime statistics.
Yep.
So we hear these statistics all the time, right? That, just statistics about the odds of African American men ending up in the criminal justice system at some point in their lifetime, and so sometimes it's 1 in 4, sometimes it's 1 in 3.
Right.
So huge disparity, racial disparities there in who's incarcerated, huge racial disparities in police officers, who they stop, who they search, who they arrest, who they handcuff. All of those things, and that's all across the country.
Right.
And so there's this tight association that comes from just the statistics on where people end up.
Right.
There's also an association that gets amplified through the media. There's also an association that we pick up, even young children can pick up from watching how we respond to each other, how we move through the world. I have a son who, when he was in first grade, I'm sitting in the kitchen, it's Thanksgiving, I'm sort of making the turkey and all this for dinner, and he starts asking me all these questions about how people see black people. And he says, I think there's something extra special there. And I said, well, what do you mean extra special? He says, I don't know, but I think there's something different. And so I asked him to sort of think about an example of what he meant, and he thought, and he says, well, remember the other day we were in the grocery store, And he says, remember there was a black guy who came in. Now this grocery store is in a neighborhood that's mostly white, and so black guy comes in, and he says, and I remember people kind of stayed away from him a little bit, and it was like he had a giant force field around him. He was in his Star Wars phase back then, right? And he says, yeah, and he, when he stood in line, his was the shortest line for a long time.
Wow, very observant kid.
Very observant. More observant, like I remembered when he said it to me, but it was so commonplace. You know, I didn't pay any attention to it really. And so as he's, relaying this, I'm thinking, wow, and so I said, well, what do you think it is? And he says, well, I don't know. And he just thought and he thought and he thought. And, finally he looks up at me and he says, I think it's fear. I said, wow, first grader can pick that up. And it's not from, watching movies or reading the newspaper. It's from watching us. It's watching how we move through the world, and what does that indicate about the status of those people?
It's from being in the world, and I think what's so interesting about that, just the astuteness is kind of breathtaking. But you can back that up with one of the studies you write about has to do with Hollywood and actors on TV,
right?
And you would think like, okay, so if I'm an actor, I can act in a way that I might have some bias, but I'm an actor. I behave like somebody else, and I have control over that.
Right. You have a script, right? That you're
exactly
following.
right. I'm not making decisions. I have somebody who's telling me what to do and how to do it.
Yeah.
And yet you find something very similar to what your son detected. That study blew me away. Tell us about that.
That's right. Well, this is a study that was conducted by several Tufts researchers, and they were interested in the role that this subtle bias could play in the media. And they took shows, very popular shows, I think the 11 most popular shows in the US at the time, CSI Miami, and they looked at Grey's Anatomy and all these shows, right? And they found that Black actors received more sort of negative sort of nonverbal behavior from the other white actors on the set. So that's what they found.
And explain how they did that, because I thought the way that they constructed that was really interesting.
Right, so they would just, basically they would splice out the black actor and they would just look at the surrounding actors.
Right.
And they were interested in nonverbal behavior, so they were looking at, so they turned the sound down and they just had people look at their faces. Did they grimace? Or, was there a frown? Or did they move away? Sort of those kinds of things. They didn't instruct them on what actual behaviors to look at, but they just said, hey, just sort of tell me, is this positive or negative kind of emotion being directed in that way? And they found just on that, these subtle things, that those who were responding to black actors had more negative nonverbal behavior.
Yeah, which is just amazing, because I can't imagine that the actors themselves would have been aware of that.
No, I don't think so, not at all.
And I don't know whether the people who are running the show. So for instance, Grey's Anatomy is an African-American showrunner, Shonda Rhimes, who created that show, whether they're even aware of that or whether it's just so commonplace that it seems normal.
I think it's so commonplace, it seems normal, and it kind of goes to show you too, because these are shows with positive characters, black actors who are in these positive roles, strong roles. And people always say, well, it's the media, it's the media. If we have more, positive, black sort of characters on television and movies, everything would be okay. But it goes to show you that it takes more than one thing. And even when you try to move the needle in this direction, there's a current, that you hit, and that you can't actually penetrate it always. And so you're trying to prevent this thing that you can end up spreading in these more subtle ways. And that was the thing that I actually found most interesting about that study, that it wasn't just the actors on the set, but the more you watch those shows, the more it was that you would catch the bias of the actors on the show. And so there was a bias contagion, so to speak.
Which is distressing. I mean, there are a few moments in here. I think ultimately I ended this book feeling somewhat hopeful, or at
Yeah.
least feeling like there's something that we as human beings can do to make this a little bit better.
Yes.
But there were moments, and I want to get to one that really had me shaking my head for about a week in
Oh, wow.
disbelief. But this one was like, man, that just really surprised me. Let's go out of the world of TV, but let's go back into the world of real life. On the area of crime, the criminal law system. Tell us about traffic stops for equipment failures. So basically, it's someone's driving along and maybe they have an expired tag or they
Right.
have a light out or something like that.
Right.
What do we know about that?
So we know that those stops are way, way more common for African American drivers than for white drivers. So the racial disparities are huge there. So for white drivers, for example, they may be as equally likely to be stopped for an equipment violation as a moving violation. So like running a stop sign or running a red light or something like that. But for black drivers, it's 2 to 1 being stopped for equipment violations versus moving violations. So it's one of the sort of major ways in which African Americans are impacted by the criminal justice system. They're stopped already. It's a different kind of situation to be stopped if you're African American because people, black drivers are nervous about what's going to happen. They're nervous about sort of how things are going to unfold, and so there's a heightened a worry about having that kind of contact with officers, but they're having that contact way more, than white drivers who are less nervous, about it.
Sure.
So.
But you yourself had a moment when you were in graduate school where
I did.
You were pulled over. Tell us about that, because I found that a pretty harrowing story.
Yeah, so this was just one day before my commencement. I was going to graduate from Harvard, and
I've heard of it.
I'm sorry?
I've heard of that school, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm driving, with my friend, my
Yeah.
girlfriend, who's also a graduate student at the time, and we were in Boston in an area that was a little, shaky.
Yeah.
So officer sees us, pulls us over. We don't know why. We're thinking we're following the rules of the road, all
Right.
that. And officer approaches us, license, insurance he's asking for. We're asking, well, why are we pulled over? No response to that. And so we're left wondering about it and so forth. And I guess the thing that I remember most, this was many years ago now, probably over 25 years ago, really, but I still remember the tone of voice, how he spoke to us. It was so disrespectful.
Right. And this was a black officer.
This was a black officer. Extremely disrespectful, and we were kind of left wondering what was going on. Tow truck shows up. Tow truck shows up right in front of the car and starts to lower, the gear, and we're like, what's going on? And then the officer comes, and he's outside my car door, and he says, exit the vehicle. So I decide, well, no, right? This isn't right. This isn't fair. I don't know what's happening. He says, oh, well, you have expired tags. So my registration had expired 6 weeks prior to that date. And I decided I wasn't going to get out of the car. I was really upset about how we had been treated, and I felt it was unfair. And so defiance kept me in the car. And I tell you, that decision triggered a whole host of decisions by this officer that I had not anticipated. So he called for backup. And a cruiser came, and then another cruiser came, and then another cruiser came. And before we know it, we're surrounded by 5 cruisers. I mean, this is all for expired tags, right? And we're sitting in the car, and then there's a crowd that starts to gather, along the sidewalk. And I just thought, wow. So we were frozen at that point. I think fear for me kept me inside the car because I was worried about what would happen. With all the cops out there, they were poised for action. And I just already couldn't believe we were being surrounded, over these tags. So so anyway, the officer ends up pulling me out of the car. He reached in and he unbuckled my seatbelt and yanked me out of the car. And I, put my hands behind my back, expecting to be handcuffed, but he lifted my arm up high above my back, and he lifted my body up, and he body slams me on the roof of the car. Not the hood, but the roof of the car, and it knocked the wind out of me. I was gasping for air, and my body was sliding down the car. And, you know, we end up getting handcuffed, and we were arrested, and we were taken in cruisers to the police precinct and handcuffed to a wall.
But you were able to make a phone call.
I was.
A phone call that not many people get to make.
Yeah, that's true. Now, the phone call you think from watching television, everybody gets to make is calling their lawyer, right? But I didn't have a lawyer, you know, because I'm in my 20s, and I didn't have a lawyer. But I did have the phone number of a dean at Harvard, and I had a phone number. She was just the week before going through the motions with me of carrying this flag, and so I was nominated by my peers and others to represent the class to carry this flag, to be the marshal for the commencement. So she's, you know, going through, sort of telling me, you know what path to take and how high to carry the flag and all of this. And she gave me her phone number. She says, if anything happens, if you run into any trouble, call me. And so I would think, okay, this counts, right? So I had her phone number. So I called her, and she spoke to the person, the arresting officer, and so forth. And I don't know what she said, but he hung up the phone and uncuffed us from the wall, and we were free to go.
But you made it to your graduation. But I mean, so you have, you know, this personal firsthand experience with this, something that you call the respect deficit.
Yeah.
And you have what I thought was a really fascinating study that you did of language.
Yes.
Where you actually took the utterances that were made in police stops and analyzed those. What did you find with that?
So we found, so this was with an interdisciplinary group of researchers at Stanford. So I'm a social psychologist, but we work with linguists, and computer scientists, and so forth. And we were able to use machine learning techniques to comb through all of these videos, right? And we developed transcripts from that, and we're able to analyze the words that officers use during these routine traffic stops. And we found, it was a respect deficit. Basically, you know, they were respectful overall, but they treated black drivers with significantly less respect than white drivers. And we can tell this with their language. So, and it was from the very beginning of the stop until the very end. So at the beginning, even in the greeting, right?
Exactly.
There was a difference.
So if they saw me, a middle-aged white guy driving along, they might say, Sir,
Mister.
Right.
Right. Middle-aged black guy, bro, dude. So that was the distinction. Even subtle things, though, right? So, like, you know, for white drivers, they would express concern for, you know, their safety.
Exactly, yeah.
They would offer reassurance. They would say, you know, it'll be okay. You know, don't worry. Less so with black drivers. So there are all these ways in which they were doing this caretaking around white drivers that black drivers didn't get as much. Right.
But you know, I don't want to give people watching this the wrong impression about this book, because I actually think that in some ways this book gives I think a pretty honest account of how difficult it is to be a police officer.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And you've done work with the Oakland Police Department and others, and there's this. It seems like there's this kind of vicious circle going on here, where there's bias. So therefore, some people in certain communities don't respect police officers, which makes it in some ways harder for police officers to do their job. And so there's this downward spiral there. But it's a serious problem. We're gonna get to some of the solutions. Let's talk about very quickly some other aspects of bias that's threaded through the criminal law system.
Okay.
Pretrial detentions.
Right. You know, so huge racial disparities there, and you know, there was, you know, research done, for example, by the Vera Institute several years ago, showing, you know, that there was, you know, big, again, racial disparities in pretrial detentions, especially for drug-related crimes, where, you know, black suspects got worse, what they call plea deals for plea bargaining.
Right.
Yeah, so it's and also, you know, part of it's driven by just economics. So blacks
Sure.
are less likely to have the money,
For cash bail and
to
things like
pay,
that.
and so they languish in jail while they're waiting for their trial, whereas white people are more likely to
Yeah.
have the money to walk away, and that makes a big difference for the outcome of the trial, because those who are waiting in jail have much worse outcomes, harsher outcomes than those who are able to walk away before the trial.
And you see it later on in the process with things like capital punishment?
Oh yeah, so we've done research on that, ourselves, and it's not even just black and white. Like, even looking at African Americans, it's how black you look that seems to be related.
Tell us a little
to,
bit more about
the
that, because
outcome.
I think that the methodology here was quite interesting, where you manipulated images and had people react to that. But tell us about that, because I found that fascinating.
Yes.
Troubling, but fascinating.
Yeah, so this is research that we did where we took a real data set that existed that was of cases over a 20-year period for people who had committed crimes in Philadelphia, who were death eligible. And we went through that data set, and we were able to get the photographs of the people in the data set. And what we found was that people who had more stereotypically black physical features or facial features, they were more than twice as likely to ultimately receive a death sentence than those who had less stereotypical features. And this is controlling for the severity of the crime
right.
and all of the things you would think to control for. We even control for the defendant's attractiveness. And whatever we controlled for, we found that there was still...
The more stereotypically black you were, the more likely you were to get a harsher penalty, including the death penalty.
Exactly.
I mean, that's something that... I find that mind-boggling. But we're gonna, again, I don't want to give people the idea that we're doomed at all, because I think there are some solutions here. But I want to lay out the severity of some of this problem. Let's take people with criminal. So we're going to move through the criminal justice system. All right, people with criminal records looking for jobs.
Right.
Once again, incredible disparity. Tell us about some of that research.
Yeah, so this was research that was first conducted by Diva Pager, and she's a sociologist, and basically she sent people with resumes to apply for positions with potential employers, and either the people she sent, they were black or they were white. They were trained again to behave in the same way. They were about the same age, so again controlling for everything they could except for race. And they also manipulated on the resume whether the person had a criminal record or not. And they found two things. One, as you might guess, that the people with a criminal record were less likely to get a call back from the employer than people who had no criminal record.
Right.
They also saw a race effect there.
A big race effect.
A big race effect. A big race effect where African Americans were less likely to be called back than white Americans, and that effect was so strong that they found that even African Americans who had a clean record, they were no more likely to get a call back from an employer than a white person who had a criminal record.
Right. So we know, and perhaps we can understand, that having a criminal record might make it more difficult for you to get a job. But what you found was that having black skin was akin to, in its effect, to having a criminal record. I mean, that's just, I find that, I mean, maybe I'm naive, I obviously am. I just find that astonishing. It's like one of those moments when I just shook my head in disbelief.